I grew up in the Horn Lake South Haven area with my mom and my sister. My dad left when I was about 2, and he was supposed to get us every other weekend, but he only showed up every once in a while, and most of the time when he did, he was too drunk to actually take us with him. I loved my dad, and I thought he hung the moon, and by him not coming to get us, I became very angry with him, and our relationship never got better, and his addictions never got better. So when I began to date, I didn't have any idea how relationships should work, really. And I got married at 18 while still in high school to a guy that I had dated for about a year and a half. And I graduated high school and went to tech school and got a job, and we were paying the bills. But about a year into our marriage, he started doing drugs and having affairs and drinking a lot. And while I continuously forgave him, I was still really, really hurt by his actions and just wanted him to love me as much as I loved him. And then at 19, I got pregnant, and I moved all my focus from my marriage to the baby, and was just really excited about being a mom. I started looking forward to all the doctor appointments so I could see the baby and maybe hear a heartbeat, or just learn what the baby was doing that week. And then during the 4th month, we had an ultrasound, and the tech didn't say much, but she left the room pretty quickly and came back with the doctor that I didn't really know, and he just kind of coldly blurted out that I was carrying a baby that had anencephaly, and that it would never survive, and if it did survive pregnancy, that it would die shortly after, and my best option was to have an abortion. But at this point, I would have to travel out of state to do it. And so I was just so angry that I stormed out, and I couldn't believe what he was telling me. So I found another doctor, and I really hoped that he would tell me something different, but he was much more compassionate, and he sat with me for over an hour and told me my daughter did have anencephaly and that she would die shortly after birth. He gave me my options, and I decided to carry her as long as I physically could. The pregnancy was really hard because people would obviously ask about my baby belly and if I was ready to be a mom, especially at 19, and most of it I just let go, but there were some times where it really, really did bother me that I wouldn't bring this baby home. And during this time, my husband just became more distant and started using more drugs and drinking more, and lost countless jobs, so it left me supporting both of us. And he would constantly remind me how worthless I was to him and to everybody, and that even if I did want to leave, that no one would want a woman who couldn't even make a baby right. So I just got lost in who I was, and I actually started to believe that he was right, and so I had to put up with this. And the night I went into labor, my husband had been drinking all day, and he got really angry on the way to the hospital and kicked me out of the car. I was only 19, and I was really scared and really didn't know what was happening. I found my way to the med and was 8 centimeters when I got there, but my doctor showed up really quickly and brought a memory box and an outfit and a blanket for her. So I got to dress her and hold her and kiss her while she lived, and she passed shortly after she was born. My husband did eventually show up to the hospital, but him and my family didn't get along very well, so I asked my family not to come to the hospital because I couldn't deal with the drama and the grief in the same time. 3 days after my daughter died, I went back to work and just started picking up shift after shift and working as much as I possibly could just to avoid home life and avoid actually feeling what I was supposed to be feeling. I became very angry with God and blamed him for all that had happened and all that I was still going through, and the abuse from my husband just got worse, and I just couldn't deal with a lot of it. So to cover up what I was feeling and to let me cope with my life, I started drinking and using drugs and just working so much that I pretty much never went home. Although I was doing all that stuff to mask what I was feeling and to help me cope with my life, I was really tired of not being able to remember the day before or the week before or even the last time I was sober.
Tough story. I know you came going, I thought we were supposed to hear the Easter story this morning. Well, you are, but you need to understand something, that Easter is about real life. Easter is a real story about real suffering and real pain, because life hurts. You know, not all the time. I understand that life is good, and there are times whenever life is just overwhelmingly good and the sun is brightly shining and things are happening great. But there are times when we get blindsided by stuff that not only takes our breath away, it knocks our legs out from underneath us, leaves us flat and broken and wondering what just happened. Life hurts. And so in Natalie's story, because she's one of our own, she's one of this family who we love dearly, who we've watched God work in her life. And I just wonder, before we dive deeply into the Easter story, I wonder, what would you do if Natalie or someone like her worked in your office, lived on your block, was a part of your extended family? I wonder if you had a chance to have a conversation with her at this point in her story, at this moment in her life, what advice would you give to her? I want all of us who are here to consider, all of us in Hernando, I want you to consider, what would you say if you were on break in the workroom and she was sitting there across the room from you and you saw her crying, you went over to just check on her and she started telling you that story, what would you say to her? I wonder what would flood your mind. I wonder what would come to you to be like, I would say this. Maybe all of us would at some point say something like, you know what, Natalie, you don't deserve that. You don't deserve to be treated that way. You didn't deserve to be kicked out of the car. You didn't deserve for your baby to die. Don't take that on yourself. Don't believe the lie that you deserve this somehow. And you know what? There's truth in that. That's true, but it's incomplete. And I wonder, does it fix anything ultimately? You know, maybe others of you would say, because some of you have found yourself here or found yourself in a similar circumstance, and your response would be, you know what? I know it's hard. It'll get better, but you just need to realize you don't need to trust people so much. You don't need to put your heart out there like that. You need to back up a little bit, because life hurts and it keeps on hurting, and you just need to realize it. Maybe you need to back up a little bit. Maybe we wouldn't be overt about it, but we'd caution her against really, putting a lot of faith in relationships, trying to put her hope there. Or maybe some of you would say something like this. In fact, I think many of us would say something like this. You need to move on. You need to walk away from that creep, right? I mean, come on. You would say something like, you don't deserve this. You don't deserve to be treated like that. So just get out. Move on. Leave the guy behind. You know, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and you're going to be okay. It's going to get better, right? It's going to be okay. And in fact, I want you to know something, Natalie, that someday you're going to find someone. You're going to find someone, and they're going to love you like you deserve to be loved, and you're going to love them, and life is going to be good, and you're going to be okay. And we'd like to say that. And that sounds like, you know what, that's what's going to help her. But I want to challenge you a little bit. If that or anything else that you would say is really the answer, then I have a question for you. Because in my dealings with people, in talking with people over and over throughout my life, certainly throughout my ministry, talking to people who are going through different hurts and different pains, why is it, if it's just a matter of finding the right person, getting in the right circumstance, and then everything is better, why is it that so many people who do end up getting in some right circumstances, things get better financially or physically or even relationally, but those people still find themselves stuck in their past sorrow, deeply wedged in what happened, whether it was last week or last month, last year, 10 years ago. I've talked to people who, if you just listen to their story, you would swear that what they are describing happened last week, and you find out it happened 20 or 30 years ago. Why is it true that we as human beings get so lodged in and stuck and captured by some past sorrow, and we don't know how to get out, and all the counsel that gets thrown at us, all the ideas that are given to us still leave us stuck in our past sorrow? Now, I know I've got a diverse crowd here. I know that some of you here would say, first of all, Rick, my story is nothing like hers. Life's been pretty good to me, or life's been pretty tough for me too, but I'm okay. I've survived. I'm not really stuck in my past. I'm not really stuck where I was. I'm fine. I'm okay. And I would say to you, well, maybe. Okay. But maybe not. Maybe you've done what many of us choose to do. You're just surviving. You're just kind of going on, and you're making a living, and you're doing what needs to be done, and you've got a family, and you're taking care of the kids, and but there's a part of you, it's calloused over. Maybe you've calloused it over time, but it's still there, and it's still a key part of you, and it still, even in fact, in many ways, defines how you act, how you relate to people, how you relate to your wife or your husband today, or how you relate to God. Because in some sense, maybe you are stuck, and you just don't know it. My deal is, our privilege is this morning here and in our Hernando campus to just say, maybe there's something that you haven't considered that literally could be the rebirth of hope. It's perspective. It's a way of seeing this, and something that needs to be done that might truly go to the heart of the matter. What if the counsel that was given to Natalie went along these lines? Natalie, I know that what you're going through seems like this is all there'll ever be, and you feel like this is as bad as it gets. But I want you to understand the best thing you can do is to seek God's forgiveness for your own sins and to forgive those who sinned against you. And listen, and let me take it a step further. Not only seek God's forgiveness for your own failures, your own faults and flaws, and forgive those who have done something to you, but do it no matter how they respond or what they do after you forgive them. Now, some of you might say, that's good, that's right. But by the silence in here, I would say that probably a lot of you are thinking, that is the stupidest thing I have ever heard. Didn't you hear her, Rick? She forgave him. She said, I forgave him over and over, but it didn't fix anything then. So why in the world would it fix anything now? Well, maybe it has to do with your understanding of forgiveness. Maybe what she was doing earlier on in that relationship by saying, I forgave him over and over, wasn't necessarily forgiveness, but it was simply, I'm going to give him another chance. I'm going to give him another chance. I'm going to give him another chance. That's not the same as forgiveness. I have found that so many people have a warped or partial or even completely wrong view of forgiveness, especially as it's taught in the New Testament because of who Christ is and what he did. In fact, that's why we are beginning actually this morning a series that will last for 11 weeks on this issue of forgiveness. And the theme of the entire series is you can't live until you forgive. Whether you believe it or not, because you may say, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. It's not going to fix anything. It's not going to change anything. But according to the New Testament, according to the story of what Christ did, the reality of that, and all the teaching that comes out of the New Testament, it is this. You can't live until you forgive. You know what the word forgive means? The word forgiveness literally means release. It means release from bondage or imprisonment. It is liberation. That's why I get to call today Releaster. You got it? I mean, this is a good day. This is a day to recognize that the possibility of being freed from the prison that you're in of some past hurt, some past abuse, some past sorrow or struggle that you've been through. And I have no desire to minimize those. Yours may go as deep as Natalie's or even deeper. I don't know what's in your past. I don't know if you suffered from childhood sexual abuse. I've talked to so many who did, or just physical abuse in a very abusive home, or verbal abuse. Maybe you went through divorce. Maybe you've gone through the tragedy of betrayal. Maybe you've been through some aspect of being abandoned or whatever. I don't know your story. All I know is The scripture makes it plain. The New Testament says over and over that forgiveness is crucial to a healthy and a whole life. You can't live until you forgive. Now, when we dive into the New Testament, when we see who Christ is and what he did, I mean, you got to remember, this makes no difference if what I'm about to tell you is simply a philosophy, an idea, a concept about what could have been. If it's just an idea and a philosophy, let's go home and do something else. But if this story really happened, that changes everything. Now, I want you to see how Christ modeled perfect forgiveness. He actually demonstrated this. He showed us what it looks like. I want you to think about the whole story that we celebrate this morning about Easter began with, at least the weekend began with, the story of the crucifixion. But you need to know what led to that. Because here's Jesus, and I don't know what you know about Christ, but I bet you that what stories you've heard about him have to do with the fact that he taught incredible truth, that he loved people, that he healed people, he healed the sick, he touched lepers, he did what nobody else would do. He didn't just heal those who had that awful disease, he went and touched them. He went and identified with them. I don't know what your understanding of Jesus and his ministry was, but I bet that it includes elements of the fact that he was truly one of the most loving and kind and also straightforward and honest people who have ever lived. And let me tell you what ended up happening. There were people who turned that into something perverted and began to accuse him of things that he never did. They began to lie about him. You ever been lied about? They began to falsely accuse him of things that he had never even hinted at. Has that ever happened to you? And then they brought him to trial, a mock trial in the middle of the night whenever they were trying to get it over with before anything could stop it. Anybody ever tried to ramrod you or railroad you through something and make something happen and blame you for it? That ever happened to you? In the New Testament, in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we read the story of how before his crucifixion, he was brought before religious leaders. I would say to you that religious people are the most dangerous kind of people. You might have thought to yourself, we're going to church this morning. We can leave the car unlocked or whatever. No. Lock your cars, keep your purse close. This is church, all right? It's full of broken people. It's full of people like me who struggle. We have sin in our life. We have flaws, and don't think you're coming here to a bunch of perfect people. I mean, come on. And so Jesus was brought by religious people, and there he was accused, and then it started turning into a free-for-all. People who didn't even know him, who just heard stories about him, they gathered up, and they started doing things like hitting him. He's on trial. It's not civil. This is not a civil trial. They're slapping him. They're spitting on him. The soldiers take a bag, put it over his head, and then they start to punch him in the face. And after they punch him, they say, all right, prophet, tell us who just hit you. Doesn't that sound interesting? That ever happened to you? And then it goes on to say that not only did they do that, but they took a crown of thorns. They took these thorns, like the thorn trees we have, big long thorns, and they took them and wove them together. They put them on his head, and then they took a stick and they wham, slapped it and beat it into his skull. It pierced into his skull. And then Pilate was like, you know what? I don't see anything wrong with him. I mean, he saw him as innocent. He kept saying to the people, I don't see any fault in this man. And he went through this circus of a trial. And finally, Pilate said, look, I'll tell you what. I'm not going to crucify him. We'll just have him flogged. And then we'll release him. Oh, thanks a lot, Pilate. You know what flogging was? We've never seen anything like this. They took him, they stripped him naked except for like a loincloth. They laid him across something, and they took a cat o' nine tails, which was a leather whip that had at the end of it 9 strands that had rock or glass or metal on it, and they would take and lay it across his back like this and then jerk it and literally shred the flesh off of his back. When someone went through a flogging before crucifixion, they were physically unrecognizable as a human being. Their face, their back, their ribs were exposed. It was a brutal beating that he endured. And then they finally, after the crowd kept saying, crucify him, crucify him. They didn't give any reason for it. They just said, crucify him, crucify him. And finally, Pilate, in order to stop a riot, said, all right, you can have him, away with him. And so they took him to the cross. Now, Romans crucified people all the time. They left roads lined with people who were crucified for standing up against Rome or doing something that was wrong. And so they were used to doing this. But Luke chapter 23 In Luke chapter 23, beginning in verse 32, here is a short description of just 3 verses that say, here's what all that I just described led up to. And then 2 others, both criminals, were led out to be executed with him, with Christ. He was crucified between 2 common thieves. When they came to a place called the skull, they nailed him to the cross. And the criminals were also crucified, one on his right and one on his left. And there Jesus is between 2 thieves hanging on a cross. And listen to what Jesus did. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. The first words out of his mouth on the cross. You know what the normal first words out of someone's mouth on a cross was? They would spit and curse and scream or just agonize. They would just rail at the ones who put them there. But I want you to understand something. The first words out of Jesus' mouth, while the hammer was still in their hands, was, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They have no idea what they're doing, but Father, forgive them. And you know what? Right after that, it says, right, that they fell on their faces and said, oh, we're so sorry, we messed up. No, it says, and the soldiers gambled for his clothes by throwing dice. Because if you didn't know it, Jesus was hanging naked on the cross. Absolute humiliation. What level of hurt have you experienced? Can you imagine what began to register in the minds of these soldiers and anybody else who was watching when they realized that Jesus' first response to those who were tormenting and abusing and had been mocking and spitting on Jesus, his first response was, Father, forgive them, while they still held the hammer in their hands. He looked them square in the eye, and I want you to understand something. They didn't deserve to be forgiven, right? They didn't deserve to be forgiven, but did that stop him from saying, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing? The answer is no. It didn't stop him. And even when they failed to respond properly, even when they didn't respond to his forgiveness with a brokenness and a contrition and a sense of, we were doing wrong. No, they just went on about their business, gambling for his clothes, treating it like another common criminal. Do you understand that Jesus not only, when he did that, not only did he forgive them, but in fact, he was taking it a step way beyond the normal forgiveness we understand. He wasn't simply forgiving them. He was doing what he does to this day, according to Hebrews. He was interceding. He was praying for them. He was speaking to God on their behalf, saying, Father, don't hold them guilty or condemned for this crime. Because you see, what needs to be clearly understood is what condemned those Roman soldiers and everybody else was not what they did to Christ on the cross. That's not what condemned them. What condemned them was what they didn't do with Christ on the cross. See, Jesus, when he prayed this, released them from owing him anything for that moment because he chose to be there. He was there because he knew this was what had to be done in order to offer forgiveness. But when he said, Father, forgive them, he was saying, it's not that you owe me anything for doing this, for putting me here. What is important is that you respond to me. What you need to do with me is trust me with your life. This is why John 3:16, when Jesus was talking to a religious leader, he said, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. Jesus, that's me. That whoever would believe in him wouldn't perish, wouldn't die, but would have everlasting life, wouldn't be condemned to separation from God forever. John 3:17, the very next verse says, for God didn't send his son into the world to condemn the world. He didn't send Jesus here so you'd be condemned. He said he sent his son in the world not to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved, delivered, rescued. Jesus modeled perfect forgiveness. When you look at that, you may be like me when I look at it and I see so many things that Jesus did. My tendency is to say, that's amazing. I mean, if I had been there to see it, it would have blown me away. But the truth is, I would have also said, but he's God. I mean, he's God. You know, I know he's God and he's man, but he's God. He can do that. But I'm just me. I'm just hurt. Here I am laying on the floor. I've been devastated by whatever it is that that's happened in my past, and I'm just laying here and you're saying, I got to get up and I got to forgive somebody? And the answer is, that comes from my heart, is I can't do that. Now you're figuring it out. Our problem is we can't live until we forgive, but we can't forgive because we don't have the resources. That's a problem. We don't have the power to forgive those who hurt us. Our hurt is too great. I'm telling you, this morning you're hearing a preacher stand up and say, you've been deeply abused, you've been deeply wounded. You need to forgive those who have wounded you. And your answer is, fine and dandy, but I don't have the power to do that. In fact, I don't even want to do that. I'm still very angry at them for what they did. And they, that hurt. And truth is, you would say the same thing. You'd say, they don't deserve to be forgiven. And I'll ask you a question. Who does? Do you deserve to be forgiven this morning? Do you deserve to be forgiven? Because at what point does the abuse that we put on others, at what point does the wrong that we do to others cross some line to where at that point we no longer deserve forgiveness? Or is it true that none of us really deserve forgiveness? Because forgiveness is a gift. Forgiveness is never something that you deserve. You may be thinking, well, forgiveness is not the only issue. This is more complicated than that. And I realize, I know how layers come in and all these different things happen and we start just surviving and moving. But the deal is, at the core, according to the New Testament, forgiveness is at the center of healing. Forgiveness is healing. You say, they don't deserve to be forgiven. Our hurt is too great. Here's a big one, they'll just keep on hurting me. You ever thought that to yourself? You thought, it's fine if I forgive them, but there it is, and they're just going to keep on hurting me. And every time I offer forgiveness, every time I forgive them, they just keep on hurting me. What you begin to realize, genuine forgiveness is not a quick therapy for easy release, for quick release, for you to just feel better. It's not a quick therapy. Forgiveness, according to the New Testament, listen, forgiveness has to become a lifestyle. Because here's what I want you to understand. Life hurts. People will fail you. Are y'all getting this morning? I mean, you're going, yeah, this is great fun. Thanks, Rick. Glad I came to church on Easter Sunday. Yeah, I know. But genuine forgiveness has to become a lifestyle, not a therapy to make us feel better about ourselves. No, there's a whole different, broader, deeper understanding of what forgiveness actually is. This requires more resources than we have on our own. This is why it's a problem. Because we can only forgive so many times before we run out of forgiver stuff, where we're like, okay, I'm done, enough. This is why when Jesus threw the whole 70 times 7, forgive him 70 times 7, some of you are like, whoa, I don't get that. And maybe there's some things we need to learn about forgiveness, but the first thing we got to recognize is we don't have the resources for this. That's right. So we just survive. We just do our best to move on. We just do our best to compensate and you know what? While there's a part of that that's noble, there's a part of that that completely avoids the real issue. Because you realize that forgiveness is unnatural for us. You know that, right? It's not natural to forgive. It's natural not to forgive. It's natural to hold back forgiveness until somebody performs or does what we feel like they need to do or whatever gyrations need to happen for us to finally go, okay, now I can forgive. But unforgiveness is actually natural. So what do we do? Well, there's something else. If you can't live until you forgive, but you don't have the ability or the resources to forgive, then there's something else you need to see, and that's where the Easter story comes in. You say, Easter has something to do with that? Yeah, let me show you. See, Jesus went through all that I just described. And his disciples, imagine if you were one of his followers and you were putting all your hope in him. You were really counting on him to be the one who was going to come and make it all right, right? And then instead of him doing that, you watched him go through this quick trial, this incredibly stupid, insane, horrifying tragedy, and then within a matter of hours, the one that you put all your hope in is dead, and you had to take him off a cross, and he's dead, and you put him in a new tomb, and he's dead, and you don't even have time to fix the body up because you got to hurry up and live up to the religious laws, and so you roll the tomb shut, and you're like, we'll come back, and all your hope is lost. And then you come back On Sunday morning, which is today, that's Easter, Sunday morning, you go back and the stone is rolled back and there's nothing in the tomb. There's just some linen cloths, the stuff that wrapped his body. It was like, whoa, where did he go? And the women were there early and they came back with the message to the other disciples. He's not there anymore. He's not in the tomb. Somebody stole the body. And we saw some angels, and the angels, and like, you saw angels? Yeah. I know you're really out of your head now. Well, we saw angels, and they said he rose again, because the angel said, don't you remember what he said? And they're like, no. You ever not heard what someone said? Your kids have, right? And then some of them are they heard, they knew, but there were some that walked all the way to a place called Emmaus, 7 miles away in Luke 24. And while they're walking, they're all sad and depressed. And Jesus shows up. He just kind of starts walking alongside the road. He comes out of a side path and he's there. And God keeps them from recognizing him at first. And he starts talking. He said, what are y'all so upset about? What are y'all talking about? And they said, haven't you heard? And they're all depressed. And they start telling him about this one that they put all their hope in. And Jesus responds to them. He says, oh, foolish of heart and slow to believe. You're not even remembering what he said. And he explained it to them. And they were like, whoa. And then he was gone. So they turned around and ran back 7 miles. They went all the way back to Jerusalem. They go to the upper room. The other disciples are there. They're talking to them. And they're like, I know that the women said you saw him, and ladies, I'm sorry, I didn't really believe you, but now we saw him, and so it's really cool. And some of the others that weren't there with him, with those two, said, you mean you saw him? And all of a sudden, Jesus comes in the room. He's in the room. And they're like, what? It's a ghost. That's what the New Testament said. Well, actually, maybe I threw in the thing, but they said it's a ghost. I mean, they were freaking out. So much so that Jesus says, I'm not a ghost. In Luke 24, he says, I'm not a ghost. Look, it's me. See my hands and my feet? Why would he show them his hands and his feet? He says, it's me. See, it's really me. And the Bible says they were standing there, and it says they were standing there in disbelief with joy and wonder. Literally, they were standing there doubting. It's like, it can't be him. Because we saw what happened. So he says, I love this about Jesus. He goes, give me something to eat. You got anything to eat? And we're like, this is cool, right? So they give him a piece of fish, and he eats it. And I'm sure they're watching and say, like, watch and see if you can see it going down. Is he like a ghost? It's like, is he transparent? So he's like, and it's funny, because in Luke 24, it says, and they were watching him eat. Like, he's chewing. Could it be him? And then he opens his mouth after he swallows, right? And he says this in Luke 24. He said, when I was with you before, I told you that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and in the Psalms must be fulfilled. All those writings that are strange to you, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all the stories about the kings and the Chronicles and Samuel, and then in the Psalms and the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and then all those weird guys, the prophets, Jeremiah and Isaiah. He starts walking through and showing them. He says, all these things had to be fulfilled. It had to happen. And then it says, and I love this, then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. And they had the aha. I see him. I never saw that before. And he said, yes, it was written long ago, that the plan was laid out. This wasn't a quick, God, I got to do something kind of a thing. God had it planned out. It was written long ago that the Messiah would suffer. Translations say that he had to suffer these things and die and rise from the dead on the third day. This was mapped out. It was there. It's in the book. It's in all these writings. It was also written, listen, it was also written that this message would be proclaimed in the authority of his names to all the nations. This is not just for you guys. This is not just for Israel. This is for everyone. And everything that was done, everything that I went through, everything that was written, and all the stuff that I fulfilled point by point by point, the way I lived, the way I died, the way I was buried, the way I rose again, standing here before you today, it was all done for this reason, that beginning in Jerusalem, you would preach this message. Listen. Here's the message. Here's the point. Here's why on Easter Sunday morning he was telling this. He says this is what it was for. There is forgiveness of sins for all who repent. There's forgiveness. There's forgiveness. What was the point of his death, his burial, and his resurrection? It was so you could experience forgiveness. See, you can't live until you forgive, but you don't have the power on your own, but you will forgive when you are forgiven. What gives you the ability to forgive is the experience of being forgiven by him. And what he said that day on Easter Sunday morning to his disciples on that day, he said, everything I did was so that you could go and speak this message. Things really can change. There is hope for change. Repentance means change. There is forgiveness of sins for those who repent. I don't know about you this morning. But I know for me, I had to come to that point of recognizing that what Jesus did wasn't some philosophy, some ideology, some religious idea. It was a real act that he did for me so that I could be forgiven. This forgiveness gives us the freedom not to have to live as victims of our hurt. That happened on the cross 2,000 years ago can free you from the hurt that right now has a grip on your throat and a grip on your soul. That forgiveness has the power to literally free you from bitterness and being totally consumed by anger at whatever was done to you back in the day. This forgiveness actually will enable you to freely love people again. Some of you haven't loved people since you were hurt so many years ago. I wrote this statement down. God's limitless love and his forgiveness becomes our wellspring of forgiveness. You're not drawing from your own ability to forgive. You're drawing from Christ in you and his ability to forgive others in your life. Man, have you ever tasted that? Have you ever tasted that? So you say, well, what do I need to do, Rick? Here's what you need to do. And I want you to hear this. At the very beginning of his ministry, when Jesus first got started, when he came, he lived 30 years. He just lived a perfect life. And then at 30 years old, on this earth, he started his ministry, public proclamation. This is why I'm here. This is who I am. And the first thing that he did in his hometown of Galilee, he went to the synagogue and they handed him the scroll of Isaiah, one of those Old Testament prophets. And they opened it up to a particular place, and in Luke 4, it records what he read to the people. This is what you need to hear. This is what I need to hear this morning. In Luke 4, verses 18 and 19, Jesus said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me." Anointed means chosen and sent. His name, Jesus Christ. Christ is not his last name. Christ is his title. He is Jesus the Christ, the sent one. He says, God has anointed me to bring good news. That's the word gospel. Good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim that captives will be released, that the blind will see, that the oppressed will be set free, and that the time of the Lord's favor has come. He said at the beginning of his ministry, I was sent here to proclaim good news to those who are poor. The word poor there means absolutely helpless, unable to do anything on their own behalf, destitute. He said, he has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, those who are completely in bondage, those who are literally captives to their broken heart, the brokenhearted, the shattered in heart. Has your love life left you shattered? Has your life left you absolutely decimated in heart? He said, that's why I've come. To give sight to the blind, to let those who are confused and blind to what's been going on, their eyes to be open so they can see, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, that God's favor has come on those who felt like his judgment or wrath was on them. I have a question for you. Have you ever seen yourself as poor? In a strange and amazing way, as only God the Redeemer could do, he who buys us back, Natalie's worst moment became the moment when she saw herself as she really was, and she saw herself as poor, brokenhearted, blind, a captive, in need of God, and it became her best moment. Have you ever seen yourself as poor? Do you see yourself as deeply in need of God, or just kind of keeping him over here? This morning, we're going to hear some more about Natalie's story to give you a chance to see how the work of God can unfold in your life and what happens. But you need to understand something. In order to come to Christ, to experience forgiveness, it requires faith. It requires faith. It requires trusting God for something you're not sure exactly what's going to happen, just as you'll see with Natalie as her story unfolded. I wonder about you this morning. Have you ever tasted forgiveness? Are you in need of God's forgiveness in your own life, or God's power to forgive others in your life? This is your morning. I want us to bow our heads.
As I left work one day in 2006, I did everything that I normally did. I put on my headphones and I walked to the bus stop where I'd stood hundreds of times before. And as I searched through the stations for something to listen to, there was a guy preaching, and he was preaching that no matter how far you've fallen or what you've done, you can always come home, and that there is hope in times of despair, that you just have to make the decision. And that message hit me like a ton of bricks, and I really saw what I had become and what my life was, and I prayed that God would change my heart and change who I was and change the life that I had still in front of me. Even though I accepted Christ and my heart had begun to change, I was still really angry and really frustrated with my past and the things that were still going on in my life, and I didn't know how to forgive or where to go from there.